Before the kings came. Before the armies and the conquests and the throne rooms and the dynasties that would define Israel's history for centuries. Before David danced before the ark and Solomon built the temple and the covenant found its magnificent architectural expression in cedar and gold on the heights of Mount Moriah. Before all of that, there was a field. A barley field on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the hill country of Judah. And in that field, in the heat of a harvest morning, a foreign woman bent her back alongside the poorest of the poor, gathering the grain that the reapers had left behind, doing the humble and exhausting work of survival in a land that was not her own, among a people whose God she had chosen to follow at the cost of everything that had previously defined her life. Her name was Ruth. And her story, from the grief of Moab to the grace of Bethlehem, from the bitterness of widowhood to the fullness of covenant love, from the gleaning at the edges of a field to the ancestry of the greatest dynasty in Israel's history, is perhaps the most quietly beautiful story in the entire biblical narrative. It is a story that does not announce itself with miracles or with the dramatic intervention of divine power in the visible and spectacular sense. There are no angels appearing in blinding light. No parting of waters. No fire from heaven. No dramatic confrontation between the human and the divine. The miracle of the book of Ruth is of a different and in some ways more demanding kind, the miracle of ordinary faithfulness maintained in the face of extraordinary loss. The miracle of a love that could have walked away and chose to stay. The miracle of a God who works not through the spectacular and the overwhelming but through the quiet, daily, human choices of people who do the right thing when the wrong thing would have been completely understandable. The story begins in famine and ends in harvest. It begins with a family leaving Bethlehem, the house of bread, as the name translates, a bitter irony in a time when the house of bread had no bread, and it ends with that family's remnant returning to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Between the leaving and the returning, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And in the space of that everything going wrong, two women demonstrated a quality of covenant faithfulness that the God who watches over the affairs of human beings honored in ways that neither of them could have imagined when they set out together on the road from Moab to Judah. In the days when the judges ruled there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Ruth 1 verse 1, the days when the judges ruled. The chronological setting is significant. The period of the judges was, in the biblical account, a time of cyclical spiritual failure in Israel, a repeating pattern of covenant faithfulness giving way to accommodation of the surrounding cultures, followed by divine judgment in the form of oppression by neighboring peoples, followed by the cry of the people for deliverance, followed by the raising up of a judge through whom God delivered them, followed eventually by a return to the same cycle. It was not Israel's finest hour. It was not a period of consistent covenant faithfulness or national spiritual health. And the famine that drove Elimelech and his family out of Bethlehem was itself, in the biblical understanding of such things, a consequence connected to the spiritual condition of the people, the land not yielding its produce because the covenant relationship between God and Israel had been compromised. Elimelech. His name meant "My God is King," a name that carried within it the entire theological confession of ancient Israelite faith. And he left Bethlehem. He left the land of the covenant, the land that God had given to Israel as the physical expression of covenant faithfulness, and went to Moab. Moab, the nation descended from Lot's son, born in the aftermath of Sodom's destruction, a people with a complicated and often adversarial relationship with Israel across the centuries. Going to Moab in a time of famine was a practical decision rooted in the reality of survival. Moab was not in famine, had food, could sustain a family that the land of Judah could not currently sustain. But it was also a movement away from the covenant land, away from the community of God's people, into the territory of a people who did not know Israel's God. His wife's name was Naomi. And his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Ruth 1 verse 2, remained there. What had begun as a temporary sojourn, the word used in the text implies a staying as a foreigner, a temporary residence rather than a permanent settlement, extended. The practical became the habitual. The temporary became the long-term. And then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Ruth 1 verse 3. He died in Moab, away from Bethlehem, away from the land of the covenant. The man whose name meant "My God is King" died in a foreign land, leaving his wife widowed and his 2 sons fatherless in a place that was not their home. And the 2 sons took Moabite wives, the name of the one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Ruth 1 verse 4, 10 years. A decade of life in Moab. The sons who had been born in Bethlehem, who carried the identity of Ephrathites from the house of bread, had now lived longer in Moab than they had in Judah. They had married Moabite women. They had put down roots. And then both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Ruth 1 verse 5. Without her 2 sons and her husband. Naomi. The woman whose name meant pleasant, who had left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 sons and had arrived in Moab as part of a family still intact, was now alone in a foreign land with 2 foreign daughters-in-law and nothing else. The life she had built in Moab had been dismantled death by death, grief by grief, until nothing remained of the family structure that had defined her existence. She was old, she was widowed, she was childless, she was in a foreign country with no means of support and no prospect of rebuilding what had been lost. By every measure of the ancient world, a world in which a woman's security depended entirely on her connection to male family members, Naomi was in the most vulnerable possible position. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Ruth 1 verse 6, the Lord had visited his people and given them food. The famine in Bethlehem was over. The news reached Naomi in Moab, the God of Israel had acted, had visited his people, had restored the agricultural abundance to the land of the covenant. And Naomi decided to return. Not with joy. Not with the eager anticipation of a homecoming long awaited. But with the quiet determination of a woman who had nothing left in Moab and at least had the possibility of dying in her own land among her own people. She set out from the place where she was, with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Ruth 1 verse 7. On the road, Naomi stopped. And in the stopping, she did something that reveals the character of this woman even in the depths of her grief. She thought about her daughters-in-law before she thought about herself. Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Ruth 1 verses 8-9, she released them. She blessed them. She sent them back to the only future she could imagine for them, back to Moab, back to their own people, back to the possibility of finding new husbands and rebuilding their lives in the culture and the community that was their own. The kindness she wished for them was the kindness of the covenant God. The Hebrew word she used was Hesed, the steadfast covenant love that was the defining characteristic of Israel's God. May the Lord deal kindly with you. The bitter widow was invoking the covenant faithfulness of the God she served as a blessing on the foreign daughters-in-law she was releasing. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth 1 verse 14, 2 responses to the same release. Orpah's response was entirely reasonable, entirely understandable, entirely what any observer of the situation would have considered the sensible and appropriate choice. She had been given permission to go. She had been blessed. She had been released from any obligation to the older woman. She kissed Naomi and went back. Her decision was not a moral failure. It was the practical, reasonable, self-protective choice of a young widow who had been given the freedom to choose her own future and chose the future that made the most human sense. But Ruth clung to her. The Hebrew word translated clung, dabak, is the same word used in Genesis 2 verse 24 for the husband cleaving to his wife in the covenant of marriage. It is a word of covenant attachment, of deliberate and committed holding on, of a bond that has been chosen and will not be let go simply because the practical circumstances no longer require it. Ruth clung to Naomi. And when Naomi said to her, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law, Ruth answered with words that have echoed across 3,000 years of human history as one of the most beautiful expressions of covenant faithfulness ever recorded in any language. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also if anything but death parts me from you. Ruth 1 verses 16 to 17. Where you go I will go. Where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people and your God my God. The declaration of Ruth to Naomi is not merely an expression of personal loyalty or family affection, though it is those things. It is a covenant declaration, a formal, complete, irrevocable commitment to a new identity, a new community, and a new God. Ruth was not merely choosing to stay with Naomi. She was choosing to become someone different. To leave behind the people of Moab and their gods, the gods she had grown up with, the religious and cultural identity that had shaped her entire life, and to take on the identity of Israel. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. She was converting. Choosing. Deciding at the side of a road in Moab, with a bitter old widow trying to send her away, to cross a boundary that could not be uncrossed. To become, from that moment forward, not a Moabite woman but a woman of Israel, a woman who had chosen the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as her own God and the people of that God as her own people. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Ruth 1 verse 18, she said no more. The determination of Ruth was so complete, the commitment so clearly irrevocable, that Naomi recognized argument as pointless. The young woman beside her was not going back to Moab. She had decided. And so they went on together. Two widows. One old and bitter. One young and foreign and newly committed to a God and a people she was about to encounter for the first time. Walking together down the road from Moab to Bethlehem. Walking toward a future that neither of them could see, toward a story that neither of them could have imagined, toward the field of a man named Boaz where everything that love and faithfulness and covenant loyalty could produce would begin to unfold in the golden light of a Bethlehem harvest morning. The road from Moab to Bethlehem was not short and it was not easy. The journey required crossing the Jordan River and ascending through the hill country of Judah, a journey of significant physical demand for two women traveling alone, one old and one foreign, with no male protection and no resources beyond whatever they carried with them. But they walked it. Together. And when they arrived, when the two women came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, the whole town was stirred because of them. Ruth 1 verse 19, the whole town was stirred. The arrival of Naomi after what must have been a decade or more of absence produced the kind of communal stir that small ancient towns produce when someone returns from a long time away, the recognition, the questions, the gathering of neighbors to see who had come back and in what condition. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Ruth 1 verse 19, the question communicates volumes. It was a question of recognition tinged with shock. The woman who had left Bethlehem with a husband and two sons and the relative security of a complete family had returned alone except for a foreign daughter-in-law, visibly aged by grief and loss and the years of a life that had not gone as planned. The women who had known her before saw what the years had done and barely recognized her. Is this Naomi? Is this the pleasant one, the woman whose name had once communicated the joy and beauty of a life well lived? And Naomi answered with words of devastating honesty that reveal the depth of her grief and the completeness of her sense of divine abandonment. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Ruth 1 verses 20 to 21, call me Mara. Bitter. Not pleasant but bitter. Naomi was renaming herself in the language of her grief, rejecting the identity her name had given her because the life she was living bore no resemblance to pleasantness. I went away full. I have come back empty. The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. The theology of Naomi's grief is honest to the point of discomfort. She was not pretending. She was not performing the spiritual composure that religious expectation sometimes demands of people in suffering. She was saying, I know who did this. It was God. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. She was not in denial about the source of her suffering. She attributed it directly to God, not with accusation but with the raw theological honesty of a woman who believed deeply enough in God's sovereignty to hold him responsible for everything that had happened to her, including the things she could not understand or accept. And yet, in the very same sentence in which she declared her bitterness and renamed herself Mara, Naomi returned to Bethlehem. She did not stay in Moab. She did not abandon the God she was accusing of dealing bitterly with her. She heard that the Lord had visited his people and she went back to the land of that Lord. The bitterness and the faithfulness coexisted in the same person at the same moment. She called God the Almighty, El Shaddai, the name that communicated divine power and sovereign sufficiency, even as she accused him of bringing her back empty. The faith that was in her was not the faith of someone who had been untested and unbroken. It was the faith of someone who had been broken and was still standing, still moving, still returning to the only place where she knew God's presence was to be found, even if she could not yet feel anything from that presence except bitterness. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Ruth 1 verse 22, at the beginning of barley harvest. The timing is not incidental. In the agricultural calendar of ancient Israel, the barley harvest in the spring was the first harvest of the year, the moment when the long winter and the waiting and the uncertainty about the land's productivity gave way to the first tangible evidence that the earth would again provide. It was the season of firstfruits, of the beginning of abundance, of the first visible expression of the Lord's provision for his people after the lean months. And into this season of beginning harvest, two widows arrived in Bethlehem. One bitter and empty. One foreign and new. And both about to discover that the God who Naomi had declared had brought her back empty was already, in the fields of a man she did not yet know, preparing to fill her again. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth 2 verse 1, Boaz. Introduced in a single sentence, a kinsman of Elimelech's, a worthy man, a name, and yet that single sentence contains within it the entire structure of what is about to unfold. A kinsman. Not merely a neighbor or a fellow Bethlehemite. A kinsman, someone connected by blood to the family of Elimelech, someone whose relationship to Naomi was not merely social but covenantal, someone within whose family circle the ancient Israelite institution of the kinsman redeemer operated. The law of Moses made provision for a specific role, the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, whose function was to preserve the family inheritance and the family name of a deceased member of the clan by marrying the widow and raising up offspring in the dead man's name. Leviticus 25 verse 25, Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 to 10, the introduction of Boaz as a kinsman of Elimelech was not merely biographical background. It was the first indication that the apparently random and desperate situation of Naomi and Ruth was operating within a framework of covenant provision that the law of Moses had established centuries earlier. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Ruth 2 verse 2, "Let me go and glean." The institution of gleaning was the ancient Israelite welfare system, the command of the law of Moses that when a field was harvested, the harvesters were not to reap to the very edges of the field or to go back and gather what had been missed or dropped. The edges of the field and the fallen grain were to be left for the poor and the foreigner. Leviticus 19 verses 9 to 10, Leviticus 23 verse 22, the gleaner, the person who came behind the harvesters to gather what had been left, was the most economically vulnerable person in ancient Israelite society. It was hard work, dependent on the goodwill of landowners who might or might not choose to honor the spirit of the law's provision, exposed to the heat and to the social vulnerability of a woman alone in a field with strangers. Ruth chose this. Not because she had better options. She had no better options. But the way she approached the choosing communicates something important about her character. She did not simply go. She asked Naomi. She said, "Let me go," presenting the plan, seeking the older woman's approval, maintaining the structure of a household that was reduced to 2 widows but was still a household. And she specified, "After him in whose sight I shall find favor," the humble acknowledgement that her success in gleaning would depend entirely on the favor of whoever owned the field she entered, that she was approaching the situation in complete dependence on the goodwill of others. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Ruth 2 verse 3, she happened to come. The Hebrew communicates the apparent randomness of the choice. She did not know whose field she was entering, did not make an informed decision to go to Boaz's field rather than someone else's. She simply went out and gleaned and arrived in the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz. The apparent randomness of her arrival in exactly the right field is one of the moments in the book of Ruth where the sovereign providence of God is most visible precisely because it is most invisible, operating through the apparently coincidental choice of a gleaning widow to enter one portion of a field rather than another, producing through that apparently random decision exactly the encounter that the entire story required. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Ruth 2 verse 4, the greeting between Boaz and his reapers is the first window into the character of the man. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you." The exchange between an employer and his workers invoking the name and the blessing of God in the ordinary transaction of the working day communicates a man for whom faith was not compartmentalized into religious settings but was woven into the texture of daily life, present in the greeting spoken to agricultural workers in a field on a harvest morning, present in the ordinary commerce of the season. A man after the pattern of his great ancestor, for Boaz was of the clan of Elimelech, and Elimelech was of Bethlehem, and Bethlehem was the city from which David would come, and the covenant faithfulness visible in Boaz's daily speech was the same covenant faithfulness that would one day be visible in the greatest king of the dynasty that descended from this harvest morning. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman, who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Ruth 2 verses 5 to 7, "Whose young woman is this?" The question Boaz asked was not the question of a man who had simply noticed a stranger in his field. It was the question of a man whose attention had been caught, by what, exactly, we are not told, but perhaps by the quality of her working, or the unfamiliarity of her face, or simply the servant's notice that a new woman had come to glean that morning. And the servant's answer tells us something crucial. She asked. She did not simply begin gleaning without seeking permission. She had come to the field steward and said, "Please let me glean." The please communicates the posture of a woman who understood her own vulnerability and approached the situation with appropriate humility, not demanding what the law gave her the right to request but requesting it with the courtesy that acknowledged her dependence on the goodwill of the household. And she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. She had been working hard all morning. In the heat of the harvest day. The foreign widow who had chosen to stay with Naomi was demonstrating the practical faithfulness that had characterized her choice at the crossroads, the willingness to do whatever was necessary, to work as hard as the work required, to be present and diligent in the unglamorous labor of survival. The covenant declaration at the crossroads had not been an emotional moment that faded when the practical demands of daily life presented themselves. It was the expression of a character that showed up consistently, in the leaving of Moab and in the gleaning in Bethlehem, in the dramatic choice and in the ordinary work. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now, listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Ruth 2 verses 8 to 9. the instruction Boaz gave Ruth was not merely practical direction. It was an act of protection and provision that went far beyond what the law required. The law required that landowners leave the edges and the dropped grain for the poor. It did not require that they instruct their workers not to harm the gleaning women. It did not require that they provide water for the gleaners from the vessels drawn for the reapers. It did not require that they invite the foreign widow to stay in one field all harvest season rather than moving from field to field in uncertainty. Everything Boaz offered Ruth in this first encounter exceeded the legal minimum. It was generous beyond obligation. It was the expression of a man whose covenant faithfulness extended past the boundaries of what was required into the territory of what love, the Hesed, the steadfast covenant love, prompted him to do. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Ruth 2 verse 10, Why have I found favor? The question of Ruth communicates her full awareness of her own social position. She was a foreigner, a Moabite, a woman with no claim on the generosity of an Israelite landowner beyond the minimal provision of the gleaning law. The favor Boaz was showing her exceeded anything she had a right to expect, and she knew it, and she asked why. The question was not merely rhetorical. It was genuine. She did not understand what had produced this extraordinary reception in a field where she had arrived as a stranger. And Boaz answered, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2 verses 11 to 12, All that you have done for your mother-in-law has been fully told to me. Boaz knew. The story of Ruth's choice at the crossroads, the covenant declaration, the leaving of Moab, the refusal to go back when Naomi released her, had already circulated through Bethlehem before Ruth arrived in Boaz's field. The small town had been stirred by the arrival of the two widows, and the story of the foreign daughter-in-law who had refused to leave had already reached the ears of the worthy man whose field Ruth had happened to enter. And Boaz named what Ruth had done in terms that connected it explicitly to the greatest act of faith in Israel's own ancestral history. You left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The parallel to Abraham was unmistakable. God had called Abraham to leave his country and his kindred and his father's house and go to a land he did not know. Genesis 12 verse 1, Ruth had done the same thing, not in response to a direct divine call but in response to love, in response to the commitment she had made to Naomi and to Naomi's God. She had left everything familiar and gone to a people she did not know. And Boaz saw in that choice the same quality of faith that had characterized the founding act of Israel's covenant history. The Lord repay you for what you have done. The Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. The image of the divine wings, the sheltering, protecting, covering wings of God under which the vulnerable find safety, appears repeatedly in the Psalms that David would later write, the Psalms that came from the same Bethlehem where Ruth was gleaning, the same family line to which Boaz belonged. Psalm 17 verse 8, Psalm 36 verse 7, Psalm 57 verse 1, Psalm 91 verse 4, Boaz was invoking an image that would become central to the poetry of his descendant. The God under whose wings Ruth had taken refuge was the God who would one day inspire his greatest royal poet to write, "How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings." The lineage of covenant faithfulness that ran from Boaz's field in Bethlehem to the Psalms of David was not merely genetic. It was theological, a shared understanding of who God was and what it meant to take refuge under his wings that expressed itself in the gleaning widow and the worthy landowner and the shepherd king who came from their union. Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Ruth 2 verse 13, Though I am not one of your servants. Ruth's response to Boaz's extraordinary generosity was not to claim it as her right or to settle into it with the comfort of someone who had found what they were looking for. It was a response of continued humility, a recognition that the kindness being shown her exceeded her status, that she was not a member of Boaz's household and had no claim on the treatment of a household member, and that the speaking kindly to her was itself a gift she received with gratitude rather than expectation. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Ruth 2 verse 14, she ate until she was satisfied. The woman who had come to Bethlehem with nothing, the widow who had arrived empty in the city of bread, ate until she was satisfied at the table of the man in whose field she was gleaning. The satisfaction is not merely physical. It is the first visible sign that the emptiness Naomi had declared, "I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty," was beginning to be addressed. Not yet fully. Not yet in the form it would eventually take. But the foreign widow who had chosen covenant faithfulness over self-preservation was sitting beside the reapers in a Bethlehem field, eating roasted grain until she was satisfied, and the steadfast love of the God under whose wings she had taken refuge was already beginning to provide. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let fall some handfuls on purpose for her and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Ruth 2 verse 16, handfuls on purpose. The instruction Boaz gave his reapers was an act of deliberate, structured generosity, not merely leaving what fell accidentally but deliberately dropping extra grain in Ruth's path, ensuring that her gleaning would yield more than the ordinary minimum of the law's provision. The generosity was concealed. Ruth would not know that the handfuls were deliberate, would experience them as the ordinary result of the reaper's work, would take them home without knowing they had been placed there for her. The kindness was not performed for recognition. It was given in a form that preserved the dignity of the receiver, making the extraordinary provision indistinguishable from ordinary harvest generosity. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Ruth 2 verses 17 to 18, an ephah of barley. Approximately 30 pounds, an extraordinary quantity for a single day's gleaning. The amount communicated to Naomi immediately that something unusual had happened, that the ordinary minimum of the gleaning law could not account for what Ruth had brought home. And Naomi said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth 2 verse 19. Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Naomi's blessing was instinctive and immediate, the response of a woman whose faith, however battered by grief, was still alive enough to recognize the fingerprints of divine provision in the extraordinary yield of Ruth's first day of gleaning. She did not yet know whose field it was. But she knew that someone had shown unusual kindness to her daughter-in-law, and she knew that unusual kindness in the circumstances of two desperate widows was worth blessing in the name of the God who orchestrated such things. And Ruth told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Ruth 2 verses 19 to 20. One of our redeemers. The word in Hebrew is goel, the kinsman redeemer. The moment Naomi heard the name Boaz, the entire structure of ancient Israelite covenant law clicked into place in her understanding. Boaz was not merely a kind landowner. He was a kinsman redeemer, a man within whose family circle the legal and covenantal provision for the restoration of Elimelech's family name and inheritance operated. The God whom Naomi had accused of bringing her back empty had not brought her back empty at all. He had brought her back to a city where a worthy man of her dead husband's clan was harvesting barley. He had directed the steps of the foreign widow to exactly that man's field on the first morning of her gleaning. He had placed Ruth in the sight of Boaz at exactly the moment when the story of her covenant faithfulness had already preceded her through the conversations of a small town. He had been working. All along. In the apparent emptiness and the bitterness and the long road from Moab. He had been working. whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi's declaration, made in the moment of recognizing the name of Boaz, reached backward through her grief and her bitterness and her renaming of herself as Mara and touched something that had never actually died in her. The recognition that the Hesed of God, the steadfast, covenant, never giving up love, had not forsaken her. Had not forsaken Elimelech or Mahlon or Chilion even in their deaths. Had not brought her back empty but had brought her back to exactly where the next chapter of the story needed to begin. The bitterness was real. And the faithfulness of God was also real. And in the name of Boaz, spoken in a small room in Bethlehem by a foreign widow who had gleaned an ephah of barley on her first morning in the city, both realities were being held together in the heart of a woman who had suffered enough to be bitter and believed enough to recognize grace when it arrived. The harvest season in ancient Israel was not a single day's work or a single week's labor. The barley harvest and the wheat harvest together spanned approximately 7 weeks, from the Feast of Firstfruits in the spring to the Feast of Weeks, the Pentecost, 50 days later. 7 weeks of daily gleaning in the fields of Bethlehem. 7 weeks of Ruth rising early and going to the field and working through the heat of the day and returning in the evening to Naomi with the grain she had gathered. 7 weeks of the slow, steady, daily accumulation of provision for 2 women who had arrived in Bethlehem with nothing. And throughout those 7 weeks, Ruth stayed close to the young women of Boaz's household, gleaning in his field, living within the protection of the space he had created for her. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Ruth 2 verse 23. She lived with her mother-in-law. The domestic detail is quietly significant. Ruth had options, theoretically. She was young. She was, in the assessment of Boaz himself, a woman whose character and faithfulness had become known throughout the community. She could have used the harvest season as an opportunity to establish herself independently in Bethlehem, to begin building a life separate from the aging and bitter widow to whom she had committed herself on the road from Moab. But she did not. She lived with Naomi. Day after day, week after week, through the full arc of the harvest season. The covenant she had declared on the road, "Where you lodge I will lodge," was being honored in the practical, unglamorous, daily reality of 2 women sharing a small dwelling in Bethlehem, one gleaning and one waiting, both living on what the field provided. And then the harvest ended. And Naomi, who had been watching and thinking across those 7 weeks with the focused attention of a woman who understood both the law of the kinsman redeemer and the character of the man who was showing such extraordinary kindness to her daughter-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" Ruth 3 verse 1, Rest. In the ancient Near Eastern context, the rest Naomi was speaking of was not merely the rest of someone who has stopped working. It was the rest of a woman established in a home, under the protection of a husband, secure within the covenant structure of family and belonging that the ancient world provided for women through marriage. Naomi had invoked this same word, rest, when she had released Ruth and Orpah on the road from Moab, praying that each would find rest in the house of a husband. Ruth 1 verse 9, now she was taking active steps to bring about the rest she had prayed for. The bitter woman who had called herself Mara was becoming, across the 7 weeks of harvest, a strategist of love, using the understanding she had of the law and of Boaz's character to create the conditions under which the covenant provision for her family's restoration could be actualized. Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Ruth 3 verses 2-4, the instructions Naomi gave Ruth have been extensively discussed by biblical scholars across centuries of interpretation. The threshing floor was a public space in ancient Israelite agricultural life, the place where the harvested grain was separated from the chaff by the action of wind and the threshing sledge, where the workers slept overnight to protect the harvested grain from theft. Naomi's instructions drew on the ancient Near Eastern legal and social conventions surrounding the kinsman redeemer, conventions in which a widow's approach to a potential redeemer at the threshing floor was a recognized way of invoking the covenant provision of the Goel law. The uncovering of the feet was a symbolic act with legal dimensions in the ancient world, a gesture that communicated Ruth's appeal to Boaz to act in the capacity of kinsman redeemer. And Ruth said to her, "All that you say I will do." Ruth 3 verse 5, "All that you say I will do." The same complete, unqualified, covenant obedience that Ruth had demonstrated at the crossroads in Moab, "Where you go I will go, where you lodge I will lodge," was being demonstrated here in her relationship with Naomi. She did not question the instructions. Did not ask for time to think or to consider the implications. Did not weigh the social risk of approaching a man at the threshing floor in the night against the potential benefit. She trusted Naomi. She trusted the framework of covenant provision within which Naomi was operating. And she went. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. Ruth 3 verses 6-7, At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" She answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Ruth 3 verses 8-9. Spread your wings over your servant. The word Ruth used, the word translated wings in this verse, is the same word Boaz had used when he blessed her in the field, saying she had come to take refuge under the wings of the Lord God of Israel. Ruth 2 verse 12, the echo was deliberate and theologically profound. Boaz had prayed that God would spread his wings over Ruth. Ruth was now asking Boaz to be the instrument of that prayer's answer, to spread his wings over her as the kinsman redeemer, to be the human expression of the divine Hesed that Boaz himself had invoked over her. She was asking him not merely to marry her but to be, in the specific covenant terms of ancient Israelite law, the redeemer of her family, the man who would preserve Elimelech's name and inheritance by marrying the widow of his son and raising up offspring in the dead man's name. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townspeople know that you are a worthy woman." Ruth 3 verses 10-11, May you be blessed by the Lord. Boaz's first response to Ruth's appeal was not surprise or embarrassment or the calculation of a man weighing his options. It was blessing. The instinctive response of a man whose first response to every significant moment in his day was to invoke the name and the blessing of God. And then he named what she had done, "You have made this last kindness greater than the first." The word he used for kindness was Hesed. The same word. The steadfast covenant love. He was saying, what you did for Naomi on the road from Moab was Hesed. And what you have done tonight, in coming to me rather than pursuing younger men who might have been more conventionally attractive marriage prospects, is an even greater Hesed. Because you are not thinking of yourself. You are thinking of Naomi. You are thinking of the covenant. You are thinking of Elimelech's name and inheritance. You are acting out of love for the dead and for the living rather than out of the natural and understandable desire to secure the best possible personal future for yourself. I will do for you all that you ask. The response of Boaz to Ruth's appeal was immediate and complete. Not, let me think about it. Not, this is complicated and I need time. Not, I am honored but there are practical considerations. I will do for you all that you ask. The worthy man whose character had been visible in every interaction with Ruth from the first morning in the field was consistent to the last detail, the same generosity, the same covenant faithfulness, the same immediate and complete response to the call of Hesed. But there was a complication. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I, Ruth 3 verse 12, a nearer redeemer. Another man, closer in family relationship to Elimelech than Boaz, who had the prior legal right and the prior legal responsibility to act as kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. The law of the Goel operated in a specific order. The nearest kinsman had the first right and the first obligation. And there was a man in Bethlehem who stood closer in the family line than Boaz. Before Boaz could act, that man's position in the covenant provision had to be addressed. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Ruth 3 verse 13, as the Lord lives. The oath Boaz swore was the most binding commitment available in the ancient Israelite world, an oath in the name of the living God, invoking the divine life as the guarantee of the human promise. Whatever the outcome of the conversation with the nearer Redeemer, Boaz was committing himself under oath before God to act. Either the other man would redeem, or Boaz would. The covenant provision would be honored. Ruth would not be left without a redeemer. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Ruth 3 verse 14, the instruction to leave before she could be recognized was not a gesture of concealment born of shame but of practical wisdom in a community where honor and reputation mattered enormously to the outcome of what was being planned. Boaz was protecting Ruth's reputation, ensuring that the legal and social process that needed to unfold at the city gate the following morning would not be complicated or undermined by any misunderstanding of what had happened at the threshing floor in the night. And he said, Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, Naomi said, How did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Ruth 3 verses 15 to 17. You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Boaz's gift of barley to Ruth as she left the threshing floor was not merely practical provision for 2 women who needed food. It was a message, a deliberate, caring, covenant-shaped message sent through Ruth to Naomi. He knew that Naomi had sent Ruth. He knew that the widow who had declared herself empty was the intelligence behind the appeal of the foreign daughter-in-law. And he sent grain back with Ruth as a sign. The woman who had come back to Bethlehem declaring herself empty was not going to remain empty. The kinsman redeemer was going to act. The provision that the covenant law had established was going to be honored. You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. The woman who had renamed herself Mara was about to be renamed again. Not by herself this time. By the God whose Hesed had never actually left her, even when she could not feel it. Then Naomi said, Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but will settle the matter today. Ruth 3 verse 18, Wait. The instruction Naomi gave Ruth after hearing everything communicated the confidence of a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding the character of the God she served and was now watching that God work with the same faithful consistency that he had always worked. The man will not rest but will settle the matter today. She knew Boaz. She had known him long enough to know that a man who made a commitment under the oath of the living God was a man who would fulfill that commitment without delay. Wait. Trust. The matter is being handled. The kinsman redeemer is already moving. The empty is already being filled. And indeed, Boaz had already gone up to the gate. Ruth 4 verse 1, the city gate, the same civic space where Lot had sat in the gate of Sodom, the same public forum that ancient Near Eastern cities used for legal proceedings and commercial transactions and the public adjudication of covenant obligations. Boaz went there immediately, in the morning, as he had promised. And the man whose name Boaz did not know, referred to in the text simply as a certain redeemer, a deliberate anonymity that biblical scholars have noted communicates something about the contrast between this unnamed man and the named and characterized Boaz, passed by. And Boaz said, Turn aside, friend. Sit down here. So he turned aside and sat down. Ruth 4 verse 1, And Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. Ruth 4 verse 2. 10 elders. The witnesses required for a legal transaction of this significance in ancient Israel. Boaz was not doing this privately or informally. He was constituting a legal assembly at the city gate, the ancient equivalent of a court proceeding, to ensure that whatever was transacted that morning would be witnessed, recorded, and legally binding according to the full force of covenant law. The worthy man was doing everything correctly, with the full weight of the community's legal structures behind it, ensuring that the redemption of Ruth and Naomi would be unassailable and permanent. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. Ruth 4 verses 3-4, the land. Boaz began with the land, with Elimelech's ancestral inheritance, the parcel of Judean soil that was the physical expression of the family's covenant claim on the promised land. The nearer Redeemer, hearing about land to be purchased at a price that would preserve a family's inheritance in Israel, said immediately, I will redeem it. Ruth 4 verse 4, the land alone was an attractive proposition. An addition to his own holdings. A practical expansion of his property without obvious complication. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Ruth 4 verse 5, the full picture. Not merely land but a wife, a Moabite wife, a foreign woman, whose offspring would inherit the land in the name of the dead man rather than being counted as the nearer Redeemer's own offspring. The widow of the dead. The obligation to raise up offspring in Mahlon's name, to perpetuate the name of a dead man rather than adding to one's own family line. The practical calculation shifted immediately. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Ruth 4 verse 6. I cannot redeem it. The unnamed man who had the prior legal right and the prior legal obligation stepped back. His calculation was economic and self-protective. The land plus a Moabite widow whose offspring would be counted as Mahlon's rather than his own was not a proposition that served his personal interests. And in stepping back, in declining the covenant obligation for reasons of self-interest, the unnamed Redeemer stepped out of the story entirely. He was not remembered. He was not named. He exercised his legal right to decline and disappeared from the narrative. While Boaz, who took on the full weight of the covenant obligation not for reasons of self-interest but for reasons of Hesed, of steadfast covenant love, became the Redeemer. The named one. The remembered one. The one whose faithfulness in this transaction would echo down through the generations of the family line he was about to join. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Ruth 4 verses 7-8, the sandal. The ancient legal symbol of the transfer of covenant obligation, a piece of footwear that in the ancient world communicated the rights of property and passage, the claim of the wearer to walk on the ground before him. The unnamed man drew off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. The right of redemption was formally and publicly transferred. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Ruth 4 verses 9-10. You are witnesses this day. The ancient formula of legal attestation, the calling of witnesses to a covenant transaction that would be permanently binding, permanently recorded in the memory of the community, permanently shaping the future of the family whose name was being perpetuated. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, who is coming into your house, like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Ruth 4 verses 11 to 12. Like Rachel and Leah. The blessing of the community over Ruth was placed her in the lineage of the great matriarchs of Israel, the women through whom the 12 tribes had been born, the women whose faithfulness and love and sometimes painful complexity had been the human substrate through which the covenant family had multiplied from one man and his wife in Mesopotamia to a nation in the land of Canaan. The foreign widow who had declared your people shall be my people was being received by those people as one of their own, placed by communal blessing in the company of the founding mothers of Israel. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Ruth 4 verse 13, the Lord gave her conception. The detail is not incidental and it is not merely biological. It is theological. In the entire book of Ruth, across 4 chapters of beautifully constructed narrative, God has not spoken a single word directly. He has not appeared in a vision. He has not sent an angel. He has not performed a miracle visible to the naked eye or dramatic to the external observer. He has worked entirely through the ordinary, through a famine and a death and a road and a choice and a field and a harvest and a threshing floor and a sandal exchanged at a city gate. Through the daily, undramatic, faithful choices of human beings who acted with ease in their ordinary circumstances. And now, in the single direct divine action recorded in the entire book, God gave Ruth conception. The woman who had been a childless widow became a mother. The emptiness that had characterized the lives of both Ruth and Naomi, the particular, devastating emptiness of women who had lost the men whose children they might have borne, was filled by the same God who had brought Naomi back to Bethlehem declaring herself empty. The Lord gave her conception. Not Boaz's love alone, though that love was real. Not the legal transaction at the city gate alone, though that transaction was necessary. Not Ruth's faithfulness alone, though that faithfulness had been extraordinary. All of those things were the human instruments through which God worked. But the conception itself, the beginning of the new life that would carry the story forward into its most extraordinary chapter, was a divine gift. The same God who had opened the womb of Sarah in her old age, who had opened the womb of Rebekah after years of barrenness, who had opened the womb of Rachel and of Leah and of Hannah, that God opened the womb of Ruth. And she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Ruth 4 verses 14 to 15, the women of Bethlehem, the same women who had gathered around Naomi at her arrival and asked in shock, Is this Naomi, who had seen the woman who went away full return empty and bitter, were now surrounding her again, not with the stunned question of recognition but with the blessing of celebration. Blessed be the Lord. Not blessed be Boaz, though Boaz had been extraordinary. Not blessed be Ruth, though Ruth had been faithful beyond any reasonable expectation. Blessed be the Lord. The women who lived in the same small town and had watched the entire story unfold recognized the primary agent of what had happened. The Lord had not left Naomi without a redeemer. He shall be to you a restorer of life. The word translated restorer in the Hebrew, Meshiv Nefesh, means literally one who brings back the soul. The son born to Ruth and Boaz was going to bring back Naomi's soul. The woman who had renamed herself Mara, who had declared her soul emptied and her life dealt with bitterly by the Almighty, was going to have her soul restored, not by the undoing of the losses she had suffered, not by the return of Elimelech or Mahlon or Chilion, not by any erasure of the grief she had carried for years, but by the birth of a child who represented the continuation and the multiplication of everything she had thought was finished. The family was not dead. The name was not cut off. The inheritance would not be lost. The soul that had been emptied was being restored. By a baby. By the child of the foreign widow who had loved her enough to choose her God and her people over every other option available. Your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. The highest praise the community of women in ancient Bethlehem could offer Ruth was to place her above 7 sons, the perfect number, the complete number, the fullness of what a woman could hope for in the ancient world where sons were the primary form of security and social standing and the continuation of the family name. Ruth was more than 7 sons to Naomi. Not because sons were not valuable but because what Ruth had done, the covenant faithfulness, the choice at the crossroads, the daily care, the gleaning, the approach to Boaz at the threshing floor, was more than any son could have been obligated to provide. A son was bound by blood and duty. Ruth had been bound by choice. By love. By the inexplicable, freely given, covenant-shaped decision of a Moabite woman to make the God of Israel her God and the people of Israel her people and the bitter old widow of her dead husband her mother. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. Ruth 4 verses 16 to 17, Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap. The image is one of the most tender in all of Scripture, the woman who had come back to Bethlehem empty, who had sat in the grief of everything lost, holding on her lap the child who was the answer to that emptiness. She who had no children now had a child on her lap. She who had lost everything now held everything that mattered. The empty arms of a grandmother receiving a grandchild who had come to her through the most unlikely of routes, through famine and death and a road in Moab and a gleaning widow and a worthy man and a sandal exchanged at a city gate and the Lord giving conception. A son has been born to Naomi. The women named the child in Naomi's honor, not in Ruth's honor, though Ruth had borne him, but in Naomi's, because the women understood what this child meant for the woman who had arrived declaring herself bitter and empty. A son has been born to Naomi. The identity that Naomi had lost when Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion died, the identity of a woman embedded in a living family, surrounded by the generation that would carry her name and her memory forward, was restored in this child. She was a grandmother now. The family had a future. The name of Elimelech would not be cut off from Israel. They named him Obed. The name means servant or worshipper, one who serves, one who worships, one whose life is oriented toward God and toward the community. It was a fitting name for the child born from the union of covenant faithfulness, from the Hesed of Ruth and the Hesed of Boaz and the sovereign providence of the God who had been working through all of it. The servant. The worshipper. The child who would grow up in a household shaped by the most profound expressions of steadfast covenant love recorded in the period of the Judges. And then Scripture does something that transforms the quiet, intimate, beautifully human story of Ruth into something enormous, something that reaches forward from the barley fields of Bethlehem into the entire subsequent history of Israel and beyond. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. Ruth 4 verse 17, 4 words and a genealogy. Obed was the father of Jesse and Jesse was the father of David. The child on Naomi's lap, the son born to the foreign widow and the worthy man at the end of a harvest season in Bethlehem, was the grandfather of David. The great king. The man after God's own heart. The warrior poet who would write the Psalms. The king who would dance before the ark. The man from whom the covenant promise of an eternal dynasty would flow. The ancestor from whom, in the fullness of time, the one whom the angel Gabriel would call the Son of the Most High would be born, he to whom God would give the throne of his father David, and who would reign over the house of Jacob forever. Luke 1 verses 32 to 33. The genealogy that closes the book of Ruth is not merely a list of names. It is a revelation, a pulling back of the curtain on the extraordinary scope of what had been accomplished through the ordinary choices of a foreign widow and a worthy man in a barley field in Bethlehem. These are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Ruth 4 verses 18 to 22, the line from Perez, the son of Judah, reaching back to the patriarchs, to David, the greatest king of Israel, ran directly through Boaz and Ruth. Through the field and the threshing floor and the city gate. Through the gleaning and the handfuls dropped on purpose and the 6 measures of barley carried home in a garment to a bitter widow. Through the choice made on a road in Moab when a young woman refused to go back and said, "Where you go I will go." The significance of Ruth's inclusion in this genealogy cannot be overstated. She was a Moabite. A foreigner. A woman from a nation that had a complicated and often adversarial relationship with Israel, a nation descended from the incestuous union of Lot and his daughter in the aftermath of Sodom's destruction. The law of Moses specified that no Ammonite or Moabite should enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Deuteronomy 23 verse 3, and yet here, in the genealogy of the greatest king of Israel, a Moabite woman's name appears. Ruth the Moabite became the great-grandmother of David. And the New Testament genealogy of Jesus Christ, recorded in the 1st chapter of Matthew, lists her there explicitly: Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Matthew 1 verses 5-6. By Ruth. The Moabite woman's name in the genealogy of the Son of God. The foreign widow who chose covenant faithfulness over comfort and security appears by name in the lineage of the one who would fulfill every covenant ever made with Israel. The woman who said, "Your God shall be my God," standing in the ancestry of the God who became flesh and dwelt among us. The significance of this is not merely sentimental. It is profoundly theological. Ruth's presence in the genealogy of Jesus communicates something essential about the character of the covenant God, that his covenant was never exclusively ethnic, never limited to those who were born within the boundaries of Israel by blood. That the faithful foreigner, the one who chose the God of Israel and the people of Israel through genuine covenant commitment rather than birth, was as fully included in the purposes of that God as any son of Abraham by blood. That the barriers that human beings erect between insiders and outsiders, between the born and the chosen, between the native and the foreigner, are not barriers that the Hesed of God recognizes. The book of Ruth was written in the period of the Judges, a period, as we have seen, of cyclical spiritual failure in Israel, of accommodation to the surrounding cultures, of the progressive abandonment of covenant faithfulness in exchange for the easier and more comfortable choices that the surrounding world presented. And in that period of national spiritual decline, the book points to 2 individuals, a foreign woman and an Israelite man, who demonstrated the covenant faithfulness that the nation as a whole was failing to maintain. Not the priests. Not the judges. Not the prominent figures of the national story. A widow from Moab and a farmer from Bethlehem, choosing Hesed in the ordinary circumstances of harvest and gleaning and the gate of a small town. The theological message is as direct as it is humbling. Covenant faithfulness is not the exclusive possession of those with the right ancestry or the right national identity. It is a quality of the heart, a disposition of steadfast, self-giving, other-oriented love that expresses itself in the ordinary choices of daily life, and that the God who is himself Hesed recognizes and honors regardless of the ethnic or national identity of the person who demonstrates it. Ruth was more faithful to the covenant of Israel than most Israelites of her generation. And God honored her faithfulness not merely personally but dynastically, making her the great-grandmother of the greatest king the covenant people had ever known. The story of Ruth also speaks with particular power to the theology of redemption, to the concept of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, that runs through the legal and narrative structure of the book. The kinsman redeemer was, in ancient Israelite law, the person whose family connection obligated him to step into the gap created by loss, to buy back the forfeited inheritance, to marry the widow, to raise up offspring in the dead man's name, to ensure that what had been lost through death and poverty was restored through covenant faithfulness. The Goel was the human instrument of restoration, the person who took on the cost of another's redemption out of love and covenant obligation combined. Boaz was Ruth's Goel. He stepped into the gap created by the deaths of Elimelech and Mahlon. He paid the price of redemption, not merely the financial transaction at the city gate but the assumption of the full covenant obligation of the kinsman redeemer, including the raising up of offspring in a dead man's name rather than his own. He did it not because the law compelled him, the law gave him the right to decline, as the nearer Redeemer demonstrated, but because Hesed moved him. Because the same steadfast covenant love that Ruth had demonstrated on the road from Moab was also present in Boaz, and that love expressed itself in the willingness to pay whatever the redemption cost without counting the personal cost. And the writers of the New Testament saw in Boaz's role as kinsman redeemer the clearest human analogy available in the Old Testament for the redemption that Jesus Christ accomplished. Jesus, who described himself as coming not to be served but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, Matthew 20 verse 28, stepped into the gap created by the human loss of the divine inheritance. He was, in the language of Hebrews, not ashamed to call them brothers, not ashamed to claim the family connection that made him the kinsman of the people he was redeeming. Hebrews 2 verse 11, he paid the full price of redemption not because any law compelled him but because love, the divine Hesed, the steadfast covenant love that is the deepest reality of who God is, moved him to take on the full weight of what human redemption required. The unnamed Redeemer who declined the obligation at the city gate represents every system of redemption that calculates the cost and decides it is too high. Every approach to human restoration that stops short of the full price because the personal cost of paying it is too great. The unnamed man was not immoral. He was simply self-protective, unwilling to impair his own inheritance for the sake of the dead man's name. And he disappeared from the story, unnamed and unremembered. While Boaz, who took the full weight of the covenant obligation on himself without calculating the personal cost, became the remembered one. The named one. The ancestor of David. The type of the one greater than Boaz who would one day stand at a different gate and pay a different price and redeem not a parcel of land in Judah but the entire human inheritance forfeited by the fall. The harvest was over. The threshing floor transaction had been completed. The sandal had been exchanged. The son had been born. And Naomi, who had arrived in Bethlehem bitter and empty and weeping, who had renamed herself Mara and accused the Almighty of testifying against her, sat in a small house in Bethlehem with a child on her lap and the sound of the women of the town outside her door saying a son has been born to Naomi and the knowledge that the God she had accused of bringing her back empty had been filling her all along, through every step of the road from Moab, through every morning of the harvest season. Through every handful of barley dropped on purpose in a field she did not know she needed to enter. He had not forsaken the living or the dead. He had not left Naomi without a redeemer. He had not allowed the name of Elimelech to be cut off from Israel. He had worked through the most ordinary of instruments, a famine, a road, a field, a harvest, a threshing floor, a city gate, a sandal, a baby, to accomplish purposes that exceeded anything that Naomi or Ruth or Boaz could have seen in the individual moments of their ordinary faithfulness. He had been present in every moment of apparent emptiness. He had been building something in the silence between Moab and Bethlehem that would not become fully visible until a shepherd boy from the same town, descended from the same child who now lay in Naomi's lap, stood before the same God and was told, "You are a man after my own heart." The child on Naomi's lap grew. As children do. As children always have, in every generation of the human story, the extraordinary potential of a new life expressing itself first in the helpless dependency of infancy and then in the gradual unfolding of a person whose existence changes the world in ways that the people who held them in their arms in those first days could not have imagined. Obed grew in Bethlehem, in the household of Boaz and Ruth, in the town where his grandfather Elimelech had been born and his grandmother Naomi had returned and his parents had met across the grain-strewn floor of a harvest field. He grew up knowing the story of his mother's choice on the road from Moab. He grew up knowing the character of his father, the worthy man whose first words each morning to his workers had been, "The Lord be with you." He grew up in a household shaped by Hesed, by the steadfast, covenant, never giving up love that had been the defining quality of both his parents' lives before he existed and remained the defining quality of the household into which he had been born. And Obed became the father of Jesse. And Jesse became the father of 8 sons, the youngest of whom was sent to tend the sheep on the hillsides around Bethlehem while his brothers stood before the prophet Samuel. And that youngest son, the one nobody thought to call in from the fields, the one whose father had not even included in the presentation of sons to the visiting prophet, the one whom God chose when everyone else was looking at the taller, more impressive, more conventionally kingly options, that youngest son's name was David. 1 Samuel 16 verses 10 to 13. David. Who would become the greatest king Israel ever knew? Who would write the Psalms that have sustained the faith of God's people across 3,000 years of human history? Who would dance before the ark with such abandoned joy that it embarrassed his wife? Who would defeat Goliath and Saul's armies and the Philistines and the Jebusites and build Jerusalem into the city that God would choose as the place where his name would dwell? Who would receive from the prophet Nathan the covenant promise that his throne would be established forever, that the Lord would be to his son a father and his son would be to the Lord a son, that the dynasty of David would endure before God forever? The covenant promise whose ultimate fulfillment would not arrive for 1,000 years but whose ultimate fulfillment would be recognized by the angel who stood before a young woman in Nazareth and said the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. Luke 1 verses 32 to 33. All of that, the Psalms and the throne and the covenant and the dynasty and the ultimate fulfillment in the Son of David who was also the Son of God, traced its human lineage back to a barley field in Bethlehem. To a morning when a foreign widow happened to enter the portion of a field belonging to a worthy man. To the choice made on a road in Moab when a young woman refused to go back and said, "Where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge, and your people shall be my people and your God my God." To the Hesed of Ruth and the Hesed of Boaz and the silent, sovereign, unhurried providence of a God who works through the ordinary choices of faithful people to accomplish purposes that stretch far beyond the horizon of what any individual human life can see. The Book of Ruth is the shortest narrative book in the Old Testament. 4 chapters. 85 verses. A story that could be read aloud in 30 minutes. And yet the theological depth of those 4 chapters, the richness of what they communicate about the character of God and the nature of covenant faithfulness and the meaning of redemption and the scope of divine sovereignty over ordinary human life, all of it exceeds what many much longer books achieve. Because the Book of Ruth does not tell its story through the spectacular and the dramatic and the obviously miraculous. It tells it through the real. Through the kind of life that most human beings actually live. Not a life of parting seas and burning bushes and voices from heaven, but a life of grief and famine and road trips and harvest seasons and the daily, unglamorous, faithful choice to keep doing the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier and more understandable. Ruth is one of only 5 women named in the genealogy of Jesus Christ that Matthew records at the opening of his Gospel. Matthew 1 verses 3 to 6, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Mary. 5 women in a genealogy that spans 2,000 years of human history from Abraham to the birth of Jesus. 5 women whose inclusion in that genealogy communicates something profound about the way God constructs the lineage of his Son, not through the conventionally respectable and the religiously impeccable but through the unexpected, the foreign, the scandalous, the grieving, the faithful. Tamar, who dressed as a prostitute to secure her rightful place in the covenant line. Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute of Jericho who hid the Israelite spies and was brought into the covenant people through her act of faith. Ruth, the Moabite widow who chose the God of Israel on a road in Moab. Bathsheba, identified in Matthew's genealogy simply as the wife of Uriah, a reminder of the most devastating moral failure in David's story and of the redemptive grace that brought Solomon from the union that began in such darkness. Mary, the young woman from Nazareth who received the announcement that she would bear the Son of the Most High and said, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." Luke 1 verse 38. 5 women. Each of them standing in the lineage of Jesus Christ as a testimony to the kind of grace that operates outside the boundaries of conventional expectation. Each of them representing a different facet of the divine Hesed that does not recognize the barriers that human beings construct between the acceptable and the unacceptable, the insider and the outsider, the worthy and the unworthy. Ruth among them is perhaps the most straightforwardly admirable, the one whose story is most clearly a story of freely given, selfless, covenant love expressed with consistency and faithfulness across the full arc of a difficult situation. And yet even Ruth's inclusion in the genealogy of Jesus Christ is a reminder that the grace that brought her into the covenant people of Israel was not something she earned by the quality of her character, extraordinary as that character was. She was a Moabite. By birth and by law, she stood outside the boundaries of the covenant community. She entered those boundaries not by birth but by choice, by the declaration on the road that your God shall be my God, and the God she chose received her completely and placed her in the most significant genealogy in human history. The theology of Ruth's inclusion in the lineage of Christ is the theology of the gospel itself. That the covenant is entered not through birth but through faith. That the foreigner who chooses the God of Israel is received as fully as the native born. That the barriers of ethnicity and national origin and legal status that would seem to exclude certain people from the purposes of God are not barriers that the divine Hesed recognizes as permanent or decisive. That the God who told Abraham all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in you was, from the very beginning, intending a covenant that was not merely for one nation but for all the families of the earth, a covenant into which the Moabite widow and the Canaanite prostitute and the Roman centurion and every person from every nation who, like Ruth, says your people shall be my people and your God my God, can enter through faith. Ruth's story anticipates the declaration of Paul in Galatians, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. Galatians 3 verses 28-29, Ruth was Abraham's offspring, not by blood but by faith. She was the heir of the promise, not by birth but by the covenant commitment made on a road in Moab when she chose the God of Israel as her God and did not go back. And God honored that faith with an inclusion in the covenant purposes that exceeded anything Ruth could have imagined standing on that road with the empty-handed old widow she had refused to leave. The book of Ruth is also, at its deepest level, a book about the hiddenness of God. About the way that God works in the ordinary texture of human life in ways that are only recognizable in retrospect, only fully understood when the story has moved far enough forward that the connections between the apparently random events of the past become visible as the purposeful movement of divine providence. In the moment when Naomi's husband died in Moab, no one could see God working. In the moment when Naomi's sons died and left her truly alone, no one could see God working. In the moment when Ruth chose to stay with Naomi on the road, it was an act of love, but the full significance of what that choice was setting in motion was invisible to everyone involved. In the moment when Ruth happened to enter Boaz's field, no divine voice announced that this was the significant moment. It happened quietly, as significant moments so often do. The God of Ruth is the God who works in the happen to, the apparent coincidence, the seeming randomness, the ordinary morning decision to glean in this field rather than that one. Who takes the freely made choices of faithful people and weaves them, without overriding a single human decision, into purposes that exceed what any of those human decisions could have achieved on its own. Who brings the foreign widow to the field of the kinsman redeemer not through a supernatural GPS system but through the simple fact that she went out to glean and came to the portion of the field that happened to belong to Boaz. And who, in that happening, was doing what he had been doing all along, working. Present. Purposeful. Patient. Moving toward the morning when a child would be placed in Naomi's arms and the women of the town would say, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a Redeemer." The New Testament epistle of James, in its beautiful and practical theology of active faith, could have been illustrated perfectly by Ruth without naming her. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? James 2 verse 14, Ruth's faith expressed itself entirely in works, in the leaving of Moab, in the gleaning in the field, in the daily care of Naomi, in the approach to Boaz at the threshing floor. Her faith was not an interior conviction that had no practical expression. It was a lived reality that showed up every morning in the choices she made and the labor she undertook and the loyalty she maintained. She did not merely say, "Where you go I will go." She went. Every day. Through the heat of the harvest season and the uncertainty of the kinsman redeemer process and the ordinary, unglamorous demands of two women surviving on the margins of a small town's economy. She went. And Boaz's faith was the same. He did not merely speak blessings over his workers, "The Lord be with you," and then go home and leave the foreign widow to the mercy of other landowners who might or might not honor the spirit of the gleaning law. He instructed his reapers to drop handfuls on purpose. He provided water. He invited her to his table. He went to the city gate in the morning as he had promised. He constituted the legal assembly. He paid the full price of redemption without counting the personal cost. His faith showed up in every practical decision of the harvest season and the gate transaction. "The Lord be with you" was not merely a formula. It was a description of a life oriented toward God in every ordinary interaction and every practical choice of every working day. The story that began with a famine and a family leaving Bethlehem and a series of deaths that stripped a woman down to nothing ended with a child on a grandmother's lap and a genealogy stretching forward into the most significant story the world would ever know. The emptiness became fullness. The bitterness became sweetness. The foreign widow who said "Your people shall be my people" became the great-grandmother of the greatest king her adopted people had ever known. And the God who had seemed absent and harsh and the source of all Naomi's bitterness revealed himself, in the clarity that only retrospect can provide, to have been present and faithful and purposefully working through every moment of the emptiness that had felt so final and so complete. Naomi was not really Mara. She had called herself bitter in the language of her grief. But the God she served had not dealt with her bitterness. He had been dealing with her all along with the same steadfast covenant love, the Hesed, that was the defining characteristic of his nature and of the story he was telling through the lives of the people he had chosen and the people who had chosen him. And he is still telling that story. Through the ordinary choices of ordinary people who, in their particular field on their particular morning, decide to glean faithfully and work diligently and act with ease toward the people in their care. Who, at their particular crossroads, refuse to go back to what is comfortable and familiar and choose instead to follow the God whose ways are not always obvious and whose purposes are not always immediately comprehensible but whose steadfast love endures forever and whose faithfulness reaches to all generations. Who, in their particular city gate, take on the full weight of the covenant obligation rather than stepping back because the personal cost is too high. Who hold the children on their laps and tell the stories and preserve the memory of the God who was present in every happening, working in every ordinary morning of a barley harvest, bringing fullness out of emptiness and restoration out of loss and kings out of widows and the Son of the Most High out of the faithfulness of a Moabite woman who said, "Where you go I will go." The foreign widow became the great-grandmother of a king. And the king's greater son became the redeemer not of a parcel of land in Judah but of all who, like Ruth, come to take refuge under his wings. The Hesed that Ruth demonstrated on the road from Moab and Boaz demonstrated in his field and at his gate was a pale but genuine reflection of the Hesed that God himself would demonstrate in the fullness of time, when the Son of David and the Son of God spread his arms wide on a hill outside Jerusalem and paid the full price of redemption without calculating the personal cost and said, "It is finished." The kinsman Redeemer had come. The inheritance was restored. The name would not be cut off. And all who come to take refuge under his wings, from every nation and every background and every road in every Moab the human heart has ever traveled, are received. Completely. As Ruth was received in Bethlehem. As one of the family. As heirs of the promise. As children of the covenant God who never forsakes the living or the dead and whose steadfast love endures forever.